Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today I am joined by my good friend. We've done a couple things now together, but this one's going to be a whole lot of fun. And my guest tonight is Dr. Gregory B. Sadler. Gregory, how you doing, my friend?
Good. That's a longer way of just saying Greg Sadler, but good
Well,
enough.
hey, we gotta amp it up a little bit here. It's a Thursday night. I don't know. I gotta say, for some reason, reading like Philip K. Dick and just off the wall sci-fi feels like a fall activity to me, and it's just like a beautiful fall night out right now. So I'm feeling it. I'm feeling the atmosphere. But we've both read Man in the High Castle somewhat recently, and you said we should do a chat about this, and I
Yeah.
said, yeah, you're right. We should do a chat about this because this book is bonkers. It is so weird. And I read
Even
Ubik.
by Dick's own admission, too.
Yes, that's the
Yeah.
thing. Is like when you hear him talk about this book, you realize that it's not just us who are flabbergasted by it, but also, the author himself. So this is the first time I've ever actually done a dedicated video to any of the Philip K. Dick works because I'm still kind of new. I've only read Ubik and now Man in the High Castle. So to all the dickheads out there, welcome. We're happy to have you here tonight. What all PKD books have you read? Have you read most of them?
Yeah, there may be one or two that I haven't read somewhere. But I went on like a big Dick reading cram thing here. I did it in 2 times. So I've got this wonderful Library of America edition, and that's when I first encountered Philip K. Dick. I'd heard about him and I saw his books in like bookstores, and I was kind of skeptical of it. I was like, yeah, the wrong kind of people seem to be interested in this, so maybe I don't want to read him. But then I was at the Fayetteville Library when I was at Fayetteville State University, and they had these Library of America versions, which is beautiful, right? And so there's 4 in one volume, 4 in another, and 5 in the other. So that's 13, if I'm not counting wrong. And so then here at the Milwaukee Library, they've got like an entire shelf of the kind of copies that you have, where they're all the individual ones. And so I just, I check out another one and another one and another one and just keep reading them. And I also read my way, which is really quite a slog, through the exegesis, which is
I've heard it's something.
Oh, go ahead.
I've heard it's something like to get through.
It is. I wouldn't recommend it actually to most readers because it's his own musings and notes, and there's letters in there. It's like a mishmash of like stuff that they found. And he had this profound religious experience that he's trying to make sense of. And it is kind of useful. And I did pick out a few places in here where he's mentioning Man in the High Castle and what the meaning is for him. But he doesn't really talk that much about Man in the High Castle in it. It's mostly his later novels. And it's a lot of it's repetitious. It's him going over the same ground. I mean, the book is like 800, it's over 900 pages. So unless you really are a, absolute, I have to know everything about Dick kind of person, you might not get that much bang for your buck. But
definitely interesting to the people out there who are going through everything. And actually, Nick in the chat says he's almost done reading every single book. And
short story. And you can get these collections of short stories by Philip K. Dick. I think there's like 6 volumes total in the collection. And the books are different size too, which doesn't work well when you put them on the shelf, right? I don't know what the company who put them together was
these
thinking.
Publishers, man, they just I don't know what they're thinking. Hayward wanted to know, is it the edition with Maze of Death and Valis that you have?
Oh, the Library of America one. This one has Man in the High Castle, 3 Stigmata, To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, and Ubik. But there is another edition that does have Maze of Death, Valis, and others in it. This one is called what is it? They all have very prosaic names. So this is the 4 novels of the 1960s. And then one of the things is like 4 novels from the 1970s, and then there's a 5 novel one put together. So yeah, and they're great. They're you can usually find them fairly cheap in used bookstores.
Yeah, and I feel like specifically with Philip K. Dick, I know even if I don't end up loving everything about the story, there's going to be ideas in there and ties back to just weird, usually even some meta stuff in there that I'm going to enjoy.
Yeah.
And I've only read Ubik, which I thought was just amazing, and then Man on the High Castle, but I've just been so impressed with these two. And what did you make of Man in the High Castle? And have you read it once or twice?
Oh, many times. I
Many
mean, the
times? Okay.
first time that I read it would have been 2008 when I was first teaching at Fayetteville State University. And the library was just a few blocks from me. So I was just, devouring books while I waited for the semester to begin. And I don't know, I probably read it at least 15 times since then.
Wow.
Not least because I actually did a whole video series on it over, I think it was this summer, maybe.
It was.
Sometimes
I watched it.
yeah.
I loved it.
Yeah, and there probably are some things that I didn't get to in the book in those videos, but I tried to cover as much as I possibly could. And the more times that this is kind of a sign of great literature. The more times you read it, the more things you notice, and you're like, "Holy crap!" And sometimes the things you notice are like, "Oh, I'm seeing a little bit more detail here." And then some of them, for me as a reader, I think it was probably like the third or fourth time, they totally change the way that you look at the work, because you're like, "Oh, this means something very different that I didn't catch this time around." So what we were going to talk about today was the role of the oracle, or the book of changes, or the I-Ching, which I think is pretty obvious to most readers if you've read your way through the entire book, because the last chapter does have, second to last chapter does have this confrontation, let's call it, between the guy who wrote the book, The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, the alternate history that's within the alternate history novel. And it turns out that he and the other characters have been using the book of changes pretty frequently. And he used it to write the entire book that he then published, The Grasshopper Lays Heavy. And then so the question is, well, what the hell is that about? I mean, why would the Oracle want to write a book as its way of influencing the world that's been occupied by Nazis and Imperial Japanese? How is that a rational response on the part of this divine entity, whatever it is? And then it goes further, because Julianne asks it, some deeper questions, and we find out that the characters realize that the world that they're living in is not the real world. They're not living in a novel. It's not like some postmodern, stranger than fiction type of thing. But they realize that the world that they're in, there's let's call it a greater world beyond it. And it's not the world depicted in The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. It's our world, according to Dick.
Yeah, and there's this weird thing where the reality that they see in the book isn't even our reality technically, because it's the Cold Wars between the Great Britannia Empire, the Britain Empire, and the United States, meaning that is actually the truth, is kind of what it's stated as. And then as the reader, you think, well, then my world's not real.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's what did me in. I go, okay, I love this book now. Like, I just think that is the tipping point for me.
Now it gets a little more paradoxical, because we've got levels, right, going on within the narrative itself. But Dick himself, in the interviews that we've been taking a look at, says that he used the I-Ching, the oracle, to write Man in the High Castle, and he relied on it for a lot more other stuff. And so when you hear that, you're like, okay, so there's yet a third level to this. This kind of makes sense. But then he pulls the rug out from under us, because he says, the oracle failed me. The oracle lies. I don't use it anymore. It's evil.
Well, I'll tell you what, I thought his journey with it is very interesting. It kind of parallels a little bit with his journey, I think, with maybe I should say psychedelics, not just drugs in general. But
Okay.
before we go any further, could you explain exactly what the I-Ching is to those who are listening and aren't aware?
Yeah, so it is a very old text in Chinese philosophy that has some religious significance as well, and people use it to guide their life. And it's you could call it a divination practice. So it's not totally unique. We have things like this in other um, cultural or religious systems. So, for example, in Africa, in traditional Yoruba or Ifa religion, there's a similar practice of divination using kola nuts and then throwing them down onto this shell or disc or things like that, and then you consult another book. And the book just happens not to be written down in that case, but it's something that's memorized, the Odu Ifa. And it's kind of similar to the I Ching. So the I Ching consists of all of these passages that are, roughly like a short paragraph, you could say, to a long paragraph in length. And the way that you decide what you're going to read is by casting coins and seeing like are they heads or tails, or yarrow stalks is another popular thing. So yarrow is a weed that grows in a lot of places and pretty flower too, and you can also use it as an antiseptic, as it turns out, and it makes these nice straight stalks, so you can throw those down, and you get these hexagrams and then it tells you what passage in the book to go to, and then you try to figure out what this passage has to do with the question or problem or issue or life situation that you're grappling with. And sometimes you might have to do it a couple times. Sometimes it seemingly really clear to you what it's saying to you. And Dick, in the novel, he says that he used it to figure out what characters ought to be doing. And so the characters themselves, four main characters: Tagomi, who's a Japanese trade mission executive, and then Julia and Frank Frink, and then Abinson himself, who writes he's the man in the high castle of the title. They all use the I Ching to try to figure out what they ought to do, and it's interesting too because they don't always listen to it.
Yeah.
Tagomi actually will say, "Oh crap, I should have consulted it at this time instead of just making my own decision." And at other times he'll be like, "Yeah, this isn't helping me out."
Yeah. And
But people use it, and Dick himself used it for a long period in his life to try to get guidance. And it's not like predicting the future. It's more like giving you stuff and saying, "You should think about this."
mhm. Kind of
Here's a
giving you
framework.
pathways, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
pathways to go down and how to, I mean, it kind of provides almost like a structure to your decisions.
yeah. And
And
that's really important. So it's not saying you have option A, B, or C. It's saying here's the overall framework that you need to think about this in, and you've been thinking about it wrong, you know?
yeah, and Dick actually used the hexagrams for the book and didn't have a story or plot or anything without it, he says. And the Man in the High Castle came about because he was working in a jewelry shop, and
Yeah.
he was working for his wife in her jewelry shop, and he absolutely hated it. So he told his wife, "I have this very important book I'm working on," and he didn't even have a book that he was working on. And she's like, "Okay, well, if it's so important, you can focus on that." And then he's like, "Oh God, I got to write a really important book." And he's like, "Well, I'll just use this thing that I've been using in my life to go and do that." Now, he was also very much interested in the Book of the Dead.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, he said he used that for a while as well. But whenever he was using the Book of Changes, right, is the alternate
Mhm.
name for it. Yeah. So when he's using the Book of Changes, if you look at his interviews, he always says that it kind of screwed him on this book, which we can get to why he feels that way. But it's interesting. You see him kind of see it in a decent light to a neutral light. And then with each interview later in his life, he gets
Right.
more and more negative towards it.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that also about his experience with drugs, it seems. So it's like a pattern with Dick when he does, when he
Yeah.
gets into something, I feel like he regresses back from it.
Well, that's an interesting parallel to draw. I mean, he really does come out hard against drugs, like in
Scanner
Scanner
Dark.
Darkly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although, Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, the drug use there is pretty scary, you know,
That is
what
a
it does to
fascinating
people.
story.
Yeah.
I haven't read it, but apparently everyone thinks
Oh,
Dick took LSD and wrote it. He took LSD after, and
yeah.
he said it was like precognition of what the experience was going to be. And then he also says that things that he writes in his novels were happening to him. And he said if he could meet one character from any of his books, it would be Tagomi.
Yeah.
He loves Tagomi. He brings up Tagomi all the time in interviews.
And, you know, Tagomi is pretty lovable. I mean, if there's anybody who is the hero of Man in the High Castle, I mean, either him or Julia Frink. I would say those are the two possible ones.
Mhm.
Frank is, you know, he's decent, but he's not a hero type. Um, you know, the spy, the operative, who goes under three different names. He's good, and he's certainly able to like show courage and stuff like that. But
Oh yeah,
he's Tagomi somehow seems more relatable
yeah,
than
I'd agree with that.
yeah.
I mean, he also has an act of mercy towards Frank, right?
Right. Yeah. Although he's doing it in part because he wants to screw over the Nazis who have, I mean, they forced him into a horrible
Yeah,
situation where he then has to rely upon the Oracle. And interestingly, that piece of jewelry that Frank
Frank
produced
made.
that has woo to it rather than wabi. Um,
Mhm.
two different sort of transcendental or aesthetic characteristics, you could say, to reintegrate his life because he has to kill the Sicker Dienst men who invade trying to get this spy. Um,
Mhm.
but I mean, he rises to the occasion, you know,
Yeah.
literally shoots him with his pistol, you know.
Yeah, he's kind of the anchor into this reality. Like we get the people who, we can relate to that are being affected because they were Americans, but he's on the other side of it, yet we find him to be a protagonist and at some points maybe rooting for him as well. And then, the
Yeah.
fact that he uses the antique gun, like all these characters are subtly linked in such cool ways. And part of that has to do with the hexagrams from the Book of
Oh
Changes.
yeah. You know, I hadn't thought about that.
I mean, you mentioned the jewelry, right? Some of
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
hexagrams that they throw in the book are one line off and they're
Oh
super close together in the text.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
I would love to know if those were the roles that Philip K. Dick did, or if those were just fictional roles that he put in the book. You know what I mean?
I mean, I suspect it's half and half, you know.
Yeah.
But the parallelism of um, Abinson doing the same thing, using the I-Ching to write the entire book, but being successful with it,
Yeah.
right? He's able to get to a conclusion that he's happy with. And you get the idea that the Grasshopper Lies Heavy is probably a longer book than Man in the High Castle is because it's covering so much, right? And they tell us about the book in the story, Man in the High Castle. Um, and then there's no like I've been deceived by the Oracle business on Abinson's part,
Yeah.
but we don't really get to see that much of him. This great author, but he's clearly Dick inserting himself into the story.
Yeah, and also the fact that the alternate reality that they see, which is not our world, but can kind of parallel our world, they see
Yeah.
San Francisco, which is where Dick wrote the novel. It,
Oh yeah, yeah.
there's like this hole in reality that just goes from San Francisco in the 60s when he wrote it to us today reading it. It's just a very wild thing. But, he said that he actually hadn't planned on Hawthorne being in the story, I don't think, like physically, except Juliana had to decide if she was going to try to save him from the assassin, like basically tell him about the assassins. And that
Yeah,
was one of
right,
the
right.
hexagram throws. And the hexagram said that she would tell him. So he had to send
So
Juliana
so if
to,
that's the logic of how the book was written, then we could say that the Oracle in the outside of the book world, where Philip K. Dick is writing the book,
yes.
reveals to Dick that Juliana should go and help out, Abinson, the author of the book in the world, who has been using the Oracle in the world. And then the Oracle would be telling Dick outside that Abinson needs to reveal, because Juliana actually brings it up, that he did the same thing that Dick did, only within the book world.
Yes,
That's kind of confusing, but
in this other fake reality.
yeah, yeah. So it would still be the Oracle calling the shots in a way, right? And then
Yes.
if that's the case, then maybe we have to call into question Dick's insistence that the Oracle left him in the lurch, because I actually think it's a pretty good ending
Well,
myself. You
that's what I
know,
wanted to ask you. What did you think of the ending? And earlier I kind of hinted at the Oracle ended up kind of turning against PKD at the end of this book, and that's in his own words. He says that,
yeah,
it's a split-tongued devil and all these other things, but his first and foremost thing he's always been consistent about is that when it came to end this book, the Oracle left him high and dry. And he says it's a very abrupt ending. He liked to think of it as an open ending. Um, I didn't think the ending was all that bad personally. But I'm also not a big critic of endings. I thought it was somewhat satisfactory.
yeah. It's not satisfying to Dick, but it is to me. Um, so the ending, is Juliana, but there's also something else that's happened in the meantime with the um, operative. I'm trying to remember what his name. Oh, Wagner, yeah.
Mhm.
And there's reflections in there on the part of Wagner, like, well, what's going to happen? Can we steer this world towards something less evil than what has become the norm? So I'm actually going to read this little line here.
Go for it.
Um, This is Wagner saying, evidently we go on as we always have from day to day. At this moment, we work against Operation Dandelion, which is this plot to use nuclear weapons against the Japanese home islands. Later on, at another moment, we work to defeat the police, but we cannot do it all at once. It is a sequence, an unfolding process. We can only control the end by making a choice at each step. He thought we can only hope and try. And then he says, on another world, possibly it is different, better. There are clear good and evil alternatives, not these obscure admixtures, these blends with no proper tool by which to entangle the components. We do not have the ideal world such as we would like, where morality is easy because cognition is easy, where one can do right with no effort because he can detect the obvious. And so, he's reflecting on condition that they're in. And a little bit later, he says, it goes on, he thought, the internecine hate, perhaps the seeds are there in that. They will eat each other at last, the various Nazi factions, and leave the rest of us here and there in the world still alive. Enough of us once more to build and hope and make a few simple plans. So it's pretty bleak, right?
Oh, yeah,
On
and
his
it's a
part.
rough world.
Yeah, but there is this, I mean, the terrible plot has been revealed and rebutted, and now there's the possibility of maybe making things better. And then we get Julianne and Hawthorne Abinson, and she is attaining clarity about things. And the Hawthorns, the Abinsons don't like her because they think that she's a disruptive influence, but she's fine with that, um, and she's going to go on. And so that's the ending, and I think that's a perfectly fine ending. It leaves things open for us. Dick did try to write a sequel, but
Yeah.
he only got like 2 chapters into it.
Yeah, so apparently, yeah, he started a sequel, and had mentioned in an interview, I am hoping to write a sequel, and
Yeah,
then got 2 chapters in, and I guess he said he really just felt like he couldn't handle reading any more about Nazi Germany. He said that, he did
a lot of reading.
a
Yeah, yeah.
lot of reading, and part of that was diving into, the history in graphic detail of, not just what the Nazis did, but what they would want to have done, had they won the war.
Yeah. You know, it's it's interesting now we recognize that researching those types of things can give a person PTSD. There was a guy, and I don't remember who he was. He was a reporter, and he was in Cleveland or Cincinnati, one of those two. And whichever of those Ohio cities it is, it's it's got more serial killers than it ought to have. So he was like researching that, why are there so many serial killers in this city? Which meant that he had to go and look at the cases. And he found over time that it was actually producing post-traumatic stress disorder in ways that mimic what happens to people in the battlefield, or, ER
Mhm.
nurses and doctors and stuff like that. And he's like, well, this can't be going on because I'm not involved in these things, but there's something about being exposed over and over and over again to these gruesome facts, you could call them, and people's interpretations of them. A lot of these Nazis were unapologetic in what they would write about what they were doing.
Yeah.
So you come to get damaged as a result. And so maybe that's part of what was going on with Dick. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
it's,
think
it's hard to tell because there were so many different ways in which he was getting damaged. you
yeah,
know?
he's one of the most interesting people ever to work in fiction, I would say. And that's actually a pretty tough list to get on. There's a lot of really wild literary background stories,
Oh
but
yeah.
PKD could be the most interesting of them all. He actually said that he invited help. Like he's like, someone can come help me write this. Like he wanted to write the sequel so bad that he was willing to let other people in on the process. But alas, I don't think it ever ended up working out. But um, the
Yeah.
reality of the Nazis winning the world, a war, as we can see in this world, is extremely bad. I mean, it
Yeah.
is there's slavery once again. Chinese citizens are considered second-rate citizens. Just some really horrible stuff. I mean, fascism, right? It's not good.
Well, and it's never quite clear what happened in Africa, but some sort of horrible genocide takes
Mhm.
place. And it's cast by one of the other more ambiguous characters, Robert Childen, who's the American antiquities dealer,
Oh yeah.
um, as being the Nazis. Just the main problem, according to Childen, is get ahead of themselves. They take on too much, and so they have to take on an entire continent. There's nothing really wrong about subjugating these people. It's just that they didn't do it in an effective way, and
It's
then
the
they
way they're
destroy.
going about these things that they could be
Yeah,
doing this
that's
in a more orderly manner.
that's Childen's point of view. I mean, he's a really interesting character too. He's not a hero.
I think
He
he's the
does.
most interesting character in the book.
Oh, really?
I mean, he is of
Okay.
which we see not just the racism that
Yeah.
is there, but how people are coping with the racism and a caste system that is in place, right? Like we
Yeah.
have like the nobility and the marshal, and you kind of bow down to this, and it's just, I mean, it's almost like a Stockholm syndrome type deal. Would you say?
Yeah, there's something like that being described in the novel. So I mean, the Japanese win along with the Nazis, and they take over the West Coast, and Childen is there, and he just sort of happens his way into his profession. It's told early on in the story because they got to have some background on the guy, that all these Japanese were kind of wild about Americana, and so he
Mhm.
can tell them about it. He's got a better background, and he's able to establish himself ahead of the other people that are selling these sorts of things. So on the one hand, he's he's exploiting the American past, but we also see him, standing up to Gomi and up to Paul, and insisting that there's this jewelry that's made by Frank and Ed. I'm blanking on his name, McSomething or other. Um, they are genuine craftsmen, and there's this opportunity for him to become very rich by selling these as charms. And he says, no, we can't do that sort of thing. And so he's got a moment where he kind of gets to take back a moral position, but he hasn't changed, I don't think. I
No.
think he's still cool with the hierarchy, and he just wants to be in the hierarchy himself,
And he also is just, he has a lot of cognitive dissonance going on. Like he even
Yeah,
says at
that's
one
right.
point when they're talking about the Book of Changes, he said, the Japanese have brought this over from the Chinese, and then he scoffs and he goes, "Ugh, Americans are the only, or I even think he says, does he say white people are the only people who could be like creative?"
Yes.
And it's
He
so
goes
funny because
back and forth with that, right? Because
yeah.
he admires the Japanese, but then because he also kind of hates and fears them and feels inferior, he endorses the Nazi ideology that, you know, only whites can be genuinely intellectual, creative. The Japanese are merely an imitative people,
Mhm.
you know. And yeah, it is cognitive dissonance because on the one hand, he's in their house, you know, and
Yeah.
he's chatting with them and he feels inferior to them, and on the other hand, this allows him to feel superior to them at the same time. And he's screwing up, right? He's talking politics when he shouldn't be, you know. He's getting himself close to getting kicked out of the place, I would say.
Oh, he's fumbling at every moment. And whenever he
Yeah.
says, you know, he looks at the Book of Changes and says, you know, Americans or whites are the only people who can be creative. It's funny because he's talking about the Japanese appropriating the Book of Changes, but that original piece of work that is very important in this world is not from America and it's not from white people, it's from China. But he doesn't even acknowledge that.
Yeah. And you know, we should mention that so it gets mentioned as the fifth Confucian classic in the I-Ching, or in the Man in the High Castle, which is true. This is a book that was very important for the Confucian tradition, but it's also part of the Taoist tradition. And that winds up being quite important because Dick says that in the time that he was studying and using the I Ching, he was becoming more and more appreciative of Taoism, which in one of the interviews, and I forget which one it is, he says that it's the only, let's call it, philosophy or religion which manages to bring together the practical and ethical rather than opposing them to each other, or the
Mhm.
moral and the expedient, you know, in clever ways. But then you also get the idea that maybe that's part of what he wants to reject later on, you know,
I he just
along with I
seems
Ching, right?
Yeah, he seems to flip a lot as he goes on. And you know, I can kind of relate because I don't know if you've ever been like I hyperfixate on stuff, so I get really into things and then I
Okay.
get too close to it and I see it in a negative light and then I reject it.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
I've
Because
done that in the past. Yeah.
yeah, it's like you feel fooled almost. Like you got the wool pulled over
Oh,
your
by
eyes.
the thing that you viewed as so good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there is a very interesting side discussion in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, which is the one about Socrates' literal last day, where he's in the prison. He's going to have to drink the hemlock, and all of his friends are there. And he actually sends his wife and kids away because he doesn't want crying. He wants to talk philosophy with them. And there's this, you know, younger guy, Phaedo, who Socrates says, you know, we want to avoid mythology. And he says, this is the hatred of arguments, or hatred of logoi, you know, accounts or speeches. And he says it's sort of like misanthropy. There's an analogy between them. How do we become misanthropic? It's by being uncritical in how we trust people. So we meet people, and instead of saying, well, most people are neither, you know, particularly good or particularly bad, they're kind of in the middle. We think, oh, they're so great, right? And then they screw us over, and then we're like, well, this is bullshit, right? And we move on to the next person. We're like, this is the real deal. They're not going to screw me over like this other person did. And of course, they screw you over, right? And so people do this with ideologies or philosophies as ways of life, or religions, or pick whatever, multi-level marketing schemes, you know,
Oh
they can
yeah.
do this with,
That's
right?
a big one. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're like, "Oh, this is gonna be the game changer, man. This Now I
Mm.
finally got it together."
The
Yeah,
magic pill.
exactly, and then they place too much confidence in it uncritically, and they wind up getting disappointed, and now it, like, shifts over to the other side. It's all bad.
Yes.
So you think Dick was doing something like that with
Well,
the
I
Jing perhaps, or
I think there is suggestions in those interviews that he did because he says that he placed some very important decisions of his life in the Book of Changes, and it just completely crashed and burned for him. And least of which, obviously, is the ending of the book that he feels a certain way about, but like real
yeah.
life decisions. And I mean, he downright says that he asked. This is with like one of the trippiest things I've heard him say about it is he said that he asked the Book of Changes if it was the devil, and it said yes. And then he said, do you work for God? And it said no. And then he said, do you lie? And it said yes. And he was like, and then the interviewer was like, so it's a paradox. It's lying that it lies. So it's a paradox. And
Yeah,
Dick
yeah.
just like completely was like, no, it's the devil. Like he just was like, no, it's the devil, obviously. So I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
he felt burned by it.
it's interesting because if you look now at the time that Dick is giving these interviews, he's had some of these experiences that are narrated in the exegesis and are going to play a role in some of his later works like Valis and Transmigration of Timothy Arthur and all of this stuff, where he's really focusing on Christianity. Now, the early Christians, the ways that, at least the intellectuals, the ways that they made sense out of the already existing religions and mythologies that were prevalent within the Greco-Roman world was to say, yeah, those gods exist. They just happen to be what we call demons. So yeah, Zeus and Hephaestus and all that's real stuff, but they're lying to you and saying that they're gods. This is the real God, Yahweh, or Jesus, or pick whatever you want. And it's kind of an ingenious strategy that they're pursuing. And I wonder if Dick isn't himself landing on that. I don't say that he's like deliberately
Right.
following that path, but Dick is the kind of person who often does just happen to wind up doing this thing, that other people were doing. And he does think that by the time that he's, close to the end of his life, he thinks that he is living in a world which is a deception, and he's one of the early Christians, and the Roman Empire never ended, and we're living in a kind of illusion. So yeah, maybe that's part of it in terms of the I-Ching. I mean, it is from a Christian perspective, it's a pagan, ritual. Interestingly, in the Man in the High Castle, when Tagomi is thinking about it, on the one hand, Tagomi frames it as something that could sort out these evil Nazis, because he frames it as if it's like the group mind of a bunch of sages, a bunch of wise men that have somehow survived. So it's like better than us, right? And who knows where it came from or when it emerged. It's one of those things that gets written down, but what's written down is a reflection of something greater that isn't just the writing. And on the other hand, Tagomi also, after he kills the SD agents and he consults the I-Ching, and he doesn't get anything that helps him, he's like, well, I guess I have to go on without it, So on the one hand, it's super powerful, super wise, and on the other hand, it can't help you out, and you're just gonna have to figure it out on your own, So he tells himself that. I mean, he gets back on track with the piece of jewelry, right? But,
Yeah, and it ends up being, from a piece of jewelry made by someone who rolled a hexagram one line from his, and then like this line is connecting them, and
the guy who he saves, as you pointed out.
yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
just it's a parallel, but it also becomes circular once he does save Frank. And in a
Because
way,
of the reciprocity, right?
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's a very Jack Nixon said trippy, and I agree. It is Philip K.
Yeah,
Dick is
yeah.
trippy in general. Um, he was asked, how do these books do in Germany and Japan? And
Oh,
he said Germany is a very complicated thing. He said that like they weren't aware that he could actually speak and read German, and there were some miscommunications, like where people thought he couldn't understand, but he did. But he said
yeah.
in Japan, the one of the biggest sticking points was the Book of Changes,
Yeah.
because they do not get down with any Confucian material at all, and they would never. It's basically, people were saying we would never do this, and he said they were just hung up on that piece of the book.
I mean,
And
I think that his Japanese interlocutors were actually probably lying to him,
you
because
think?
Confucianism, so they're not reading the Confucian classics as such, but Confucianism is one of the things that kind of flowed into Japanese culture early on from Chinese culture, because it was only like you could say like 19th, 20th century that the Japanese are like, we're superior to you Chinese. Before they were always like, I hope they don't invade us. You know?
He said his book sold very well. He even made $40 one year. That's what he said.
You know, this is totally off topic, but one of the interviews that we were looking at, because they range over all these topics, he was talking about this scam that the publishers would do. Did you notice that part?
I didn't see this part.
Okay, so they would print 2,000 copies of your book, and you would get royalties on those copies. And then they would sell 500, they would trash the rest. He calls it pulping them, which I guess means they just go back into, getting turned into wood pulp and new paper. And then they would turn it over to like Book of the Month Club. And he said that this is the kiss of death for an author. It sounds like it's a great thing because now all these copies of your book are getting out of there, but they sell them for $1 and you get 1 cent on the dollar, as opposed to, for every copy you're selling, through, a trade publisher, you're getting like 10 cents or something like that, which was decent money back then. And so he said, you'd never want to actually have your book be successful enough to go to the Book of the Month Club, because that will ruin you financially as an author. He says, I'm not the only one this happened to, this happened to this guy and this guy and this guy.
Unless if it's Oprah's book club.
True.
If it's Oprah's book club, you're good, because every person's going to go out and buy it because they saw it on Oprah.
Is Oprah's book club, though, it's not publishing the books as Oprah's book club.
No, she's just saying, I love this book. Can I talk to you? And then,
so that would definitely help you as an author, right? Because
certainly.
You've already got your royalty arrangement with the press. Whoever, it could be, I don't know, Penguin or something, and you're going to make the money, a given amount of money per unit, no matter what happens, right?
Yeah.
So getting Oprah to say, "Hey, you should buy this book; it's wonderful," then you sell another 1 million copies or something. That's pretty good. But if Oprah herself was printing them and giving you just pennies on each copy, now not quite so good. I mean, that's effective. I mean, is that what's happening with the music business?
It's probably worse than that.
Yeah, I mean, they're not publishing in the original sense, because what they're doing is they're just taking the MP3s from the musicians themselves, and then they're just bundling them together on their platforms, and they pay the musicians a tiny amount per stream, or just minuscule, so they're not really publishers as such.
Yeah.
They're just distributors, I guess.
Yeah. And I think most musicians make their money on tour, whereas I don't think author tours make all that much money. Do you think Oprah would have liked Philip K. Dick? I don't think she would have.
No. I mean, first of all, I don't think she would have really understood. I don't think Oprah was what we call an intellectual anyway, so I don't think she would have made an awful
She's a big fan of the channel. She's a huge fan of the channel. So Oprah, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's great.
If you're watching.
Well, no, I may have shot your chances to hell, I mean, Philip K. Dick, I mean, there's a broader issue, right? Why isn't he more widely read than he is? Because he's a great novelist. He's got a huge catalog, right? So if you find that you like a little bit of his stuff, you can go on to more and more. Well, it is demanding. I mean, there are some stuff where it's just kind of pulp, but that's not the really good stuff. And he didn't even like those. He just wrote those to make money, he says, right? What he really wanted to do was like work out big philosophical thoughts through narrative,
Yeah, and I think, with Man in the High Castle, he's dealing a lot with the intertwined nature of history and fate, and what that means for the people in the fallout of it. And, obviously, Philip K. Dick thought there were other realities. So I know, Ubik and Scanner Darkly, and this one, for I think the most general of readers, this one kind of falls to the bottom a lot. I see a lot of people say, oh, Man in the High Castle, that's a bad ending. I'm not super into it. But in some ways, it almost feels like just based on the interviews I've read with Philip K. Dick, that this was almost like I want to say like his not his magnum opus, but like his love, like his love being put into this. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah, I think it
pet
gets
project.
eclipsed by some of his later novels,
Yeah.
right? Like Ubik you mentioned, and Scanner Darkly, Flow My Tears, the policeman said he talks about that one a lot. And then the things that he was really interested in the end, like Valis, you know.
Yeah.
And in the exegesis, like I mentioned, he doesn't talk about Man in the High Castle all that much, but when he does, he he says that well, here's one example. So this is um, from about one third of the way through. He's talking about the Book of Acts, and he says, suppose the Book of Acts is regarded not as a book made up of words, but a landscape. Let's say it appears, enters, exists in our spurious interpolation as a book. This is hard to express. It's a book writing in our world, but our world isn't real. So the Book of Acts is in actuality not really a book at all. Our glimpse of reality is to see it as a book, one out of literally millions. And then he goes on and he says, I entered that book and aided by the plasmic life form. This is like his, thing that he experienced. Correctly experienced it not as a book about the world, but the world itself, like Grasshopper in The Man in the High Castle and V. Sladek's parody, books within books, the real world turned into a book and a book turned into a world. And then he goes on and he says, we are totally scripted after all, rigidly deterministically programmed, which is the book and which is the world. And, now some of this you could be like, well, he was probably taking drugs. It's kind of hippy dippy stuff, but, maybe there's something more to that. And he does bring up Man in the High Castle at a couple other points, usually in terms of like worlds and fakes. And he even did some diagrams about how our world and the world in The Man in the High Castle fit together, trying to, kind of chart that relation out. So, clearly he thought there was some serious metaphysical depth in that. I mean, this would actually be a good segue to talk about what's missing in the series because they left this entire dimension out, I mean the TV series,
Oh yeah.
which is good, but you don't have any reference to the Oracle, the I-Ching in it, and the book, the Grasshopper Lies Heavy, isn't a book anymore. It's like movies.
Which
That
is interesting that it changed in its medium to another, like, you know what I mean? Like it became film whenever we were watching a film and it's a
oh
book
yeah,
when we
yeah,
read the book. I actually
yeah.
love that. That's one of my favorite decisions that they made for the changes, because let's be honest, the show is vastly different. The characters are vastly different. Though I do think Childan is in the same spirit
I think
of
Tagomi is too. Actually, the same humanity in him comes through in the character in
yeah.
the show. Um, I mean, there could be elements. Julianne is courageous. She does a bunch of other stuff that she wouldn't normally do, but
And she has a
yeah, but then
sister, and she, her and Frank's relationship is actually really good in the show, in my opinion, and how they move on from that and
yeah,
being separated, because in the book they're divorced, I think, right?
mhm,
They're just
that's right.
separated.
Yeah,
Or in the show, they are almost forcefully ripped apart. Oh, I love Jared. Jared, by the way, hello, Jared. Jared says, I thought the show was excellent, just a very, very loose adaptation, but that usually works best for PKD. And he also said, man, The High Castle was a tough book for me. I think it's PKD's best concept, but the execution falls short of its potential. And I also think the show was excellent. Did you enjoy the show?
I did, and it's fun to go along with. And at a certain point, you just you're like, well, they're so far off book.
Let's
It's
just
just a
enjoy it.
exactly. I mean, part of what's missing is the depth that the discussion of the Oracle brings with it.
Mhm.
Um, But how would you depict that? I mean, that's really hard to film in a way that people are going to pay attention to. You would just have somebody like dropping coins or yarrow stocks, and then they open up a book and they're like, "All right, what's the chapter?"
Yeah,
You know?
not the
I
most
mean,
visually appeasing thing.
the way that we would do it nowadays, if we wanted to do that, is like you'd throw the Euro stocks, and the Euro stocks would like float up in the air, and the trigrams would be above them, but that's not the way it works. I mean, it's much more mundane.
Yeah,
Um, oh, this is a good observation. That happened to all PKD adaptations. They take the idea in the sci-fi world, but leave out all the subtlety.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes it's not just subtlety though. It might just like be big elements. I mean, so Philip K. Dick only got to see one adaptation of his work, and that was Blade Runner.
Mhm.
And he was asked in interviews about it, and he basically said, "I consider it to be a work separate from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?" Ridley Scott is very visual. I don't know that he actually got the book. And you think about the things that are, and it's a great movie. I mean, I grew up on watching that. It's really quite wonderful. But then reading the book, I was like, holy shit, there was a lot of stuff that really was important, like Mercerism, or there isn't any Roy Beatty having this wonderful moment of recognizing the value of life. He's just trying to kill Deckard, and that's it. And Deckard kills him. And so there's a lot of interesting elements, and we can then say, okay, well, maybe Dick is right, and actually maybe that comment is completely right as well, that that Nick said.
Mhm.
Maybe every time that you do that, you just generate a separate work, and loosely inspired, or as Jared put, very loose adaptation kind of
Yeah,
makes
and
sense.
Jared also says people don't love metaphysics in their film and TV, which
Depends
I
on who
think
it is. I mean,
I
some
would say
people
I
do.
do, but I know
Yeah,
I'm not the general. We and you probably aren't the general viewers, right?
yeah.
We don't watch
I
Mass
mean,
Singer.
in order to make it true to whatever it's drawing upon, and in order to make it interesting, you would almost have to hire somebody who has a lot of different skill sets. They would have to really understand the metaphysics, and they couldn't be like just a professorial type giving lectures. It's got to be some you got to be able to adapt it somehow, right?
Yeah, I
And
think
that's tricky.
yeah, and I do think there are some things that are just simply better as books. Um,
Yeah,
I read a lot of fantasy books, and the big thing is this fantasy series going to get an adaptation because of the Game of Thrones show being such a
right.
success? And I just look at some of these that people want to get made, and I'm like, guys, this is so much better as literature. Like it's so
Yeah.
much better as a written word. You don't want to see the disservice that they can do to your favorite story. It can happen, and it can be very bad. Now, I would say that
I think Game of Thrones could have been done effectively. Those two showrunners were not the guys to do it. They didn't really understand the series. But I think I mean, it would take a much longer narrative. And you would have had to have like not, monkeyed around with things like changing who the others were, just leaving them more vague. And
yeah.
others in the book are the White Walkers in the show, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I think it could have been done. But there's others where I don't think it can be done effectively. Like, I don't think that you're ever going to see a good adaptation of Earthsea. Um,
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. Blood Meridian comes to mind. That's not fantasy, but Blood Meridian has
okay.
been historical for being very tough to adapt, and people have failed and tried, and
Yeah, yeah.
they're going to try again. Apparently, McCarthy actually worked on the screenplay for it, but I think that that's another book that would be very difficult to translate its
Oh,
value to just on a screen. So
Daniel has an interesting observation here about, I mean, other Dick novels that would be really tough to adapt. I think this is right. Three Stigmata. There's so much weird stuff going on in that would be quite tricky. I'm not even sure if we could adequately represent the Perky Pat um, what do they call those? These constructs that you take some drugs and now you're like living in this diorama, that's kind of tough to do.
Maybe that's it.
Um,
We all need to take LSD before we watch a Philip K. Dick adaptation. Maybe that's
well, that is one drug I don't want to try,
No, I'm good.
Yeah,
Nick says, I really want to see a Ubik movie happen. We
that
just
would
need a
be
very
tough to
weird and
do
thoughtful
too.
director to do it. And you know what? When I read Ubik, I immediately was like, oh, is there an adaptation for this? And there was none that I saw, unless if I missed it. And it's just like, that's one I could kind of see. Like if you get the right person, I think you can make it happen. And by the way, and I know this isn't an Ubik stream, but I love Ubik, how everything costs money. It's like my favorite thing. I said
Yeah.
this whenever I mentioned the book in a wrap up. I said it felt like he went to Ocean City, Maryland and realized how expensive everything was and was like, I'm putting that in my book. Like this has pissed me off to the point where I'm like, you know what? You got to pay the drawer to open. Like,
Yeah. I mean, some people have said that what's going on there is sort of a bad version of what we call the Internet of Things these days,
mhm.
where the Internet of Things would be charging you for everything. Imagine if, like, Alexa, every time she gives you an answer, she
Yeah.
charges you a nickel
Ask
or
for a
something.
tip. She
Yeah,
spins the way the thing
exactly.
says, tip
She
20%.
puts her hand out somehow. Yeah.
That's the most PKD reality that we could ever live in. That's very
Yeah.
Ubik.
Now, Scanner Darkly, I did like the Scanner Darkly film. And I think that doing it with the rotoscope thing was kind of cool too.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it's been a while since I've seen it. I think it's at least 10 years. So I don't know. I don't remember enough to be able to say, yeah, it was really on point, but it could be the most faithful Philip K. Dick adaptation because, as we pointed out already, there aren't very many faithful Philip K. Dick adaptations, right? So the bar is kind of low for that. But I
It's
mean,
my next book that I'm gonna read from him actually is A Scanner Darkly.
oh really?
Yeah.
That's my favorite one. Man in the High Castle used to be my favorite one years back. Um, but somehow Scanner Darkly ended up supplanting it.
Yeah. So what I will say about Man in the High Castle is actually Jared kind of talked about earlier. He kind of struggled with it. Like he loves like the concepts in it, but like just the way it went wasn't exactly what he would have probably wanted. And that's kind of how I felt when I finished it. But I will say the
Okay.
further I got away from it, and I will say watching like would we call them lectures on it? It feels like a lecture, but
Yeah,
it's
I
really
mean,
just
you could call them that. I mean, I call them speculative fiction studies, but that doesn't tell you much of anything, does it?
well, watching
Well,
your videos, like
yeah,
it helped me appreciate it even more and kind of think of things in a different light, especially even honestly thinking about what's the Swiss Nazi Joe and how
oh,
he
yeah.
seems like he was really convinced of these things and then switches. And the more I
Yeah,
thought about it, I was like, man, you
he's
have
a
a point.
weirdo, isn't he? I
He is
mean, you
strange.
don't really know what he actually is committed to. He's got all
No.
these layers of lies and stuff, and he gets killed off before we can really figure out who he is.
Yeah, and then he had like whenever she's like, "So you're German," and he said Swiss, and you're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
okay, so he's a Swiss Nazi, gotcha." Um, the way Dick handles like
Yeah, you're like,
fascism,
how many Swiss Nazis could there have been? I mean,
yeah,
there were sympathizers all over the place, right? But what's the deal with this guy? And he tells his story about his brothers actually, fighting he and them as commandos. Maybe that's real, maybe that's not. Who knows?
yeah, and he was supposed to be in Africa, wasn't it? Like, wasn't
Yeah,
he the guy fighting in Africa? Yeah, and yeah, so I thought more about that character, and I was like, you know what? I got a lot more out of that book than I realized. And then when I started reading the PKD interviews, I was like, I really like this book. Like, whenever you can come on and talk for an hour just about like the story behind the story, to me,
yeah.
like that's the kind of that's why I have a channel, honestly, is because I love just
Oh,
learning about these things, and the process that gets put into them. And the fact that he wrote this book with hexagrams is just like mind-boggling. Like
yeah. I mean, I couldn't do that. I mean, the trust that you'd have to have in the process, I don't have that
I
for
think he really did trust it based on those interviews. I think he genuinely was believing in it.
yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't. I don't think it was a like ha ha ha. Let's look at my horoscope in the paper type deal. I think he was very much like a believer in it, and uh, unfortunately, kind of bit him in the ass.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Well, I mean, he tapped out what he could get from it, you know? And it's not as if it promised him, "Hey, I'm gonna, make your
it's
book
true.
perfect," or something like that. There's a lot of like projecting things into it and onto it that happens with divination. So
Yeah. Oh, Nick, who is like the biggest Philip K. Dick fan I know, says that was my experience as well. It used to be
oh,
my least
interesting.
favorite of his famous works, but the more you think about it, the better it gets. Yeah, and I do love the concept, which honestly, we're talking about PKD adaptations, and speaking of Man in the High Castle, just the concept of this book and the setting in San Francisco, just to me is enough. Like I'm like, okay,
Okay.
that's as interesting as it gets. Like that is he really going to write a story about when the Nazis won? That's a wild thing. Now, I would say in our day and age, like everything's about Nazis. It feels like if it goes into historical text or like so many stories revolve around World War II, right?
Yeah.
But this and the way he set up the San Francisco ghetto and everything, I was okay hearing another version of the story. Does that make sense? Like I was like,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
down to go back to this again and see it in a different way. So I think that's why the adaptation worked for me and why I can still appreciate the book as well.
Yeah. I mean, the adaptation went so much further in narrative than the book did. And I don't mean further like deeper. I just mean there's all these other things going on. And it was
More
also
threads.
like paying attention to, I mean, we only get like outside pictures of what's happening in the Nazi power struggles within the Reich. We're getting like
Mhm.
what the Americans think of it and a little bit about what the various Nazi officials think of it, but they're all stationed over here. And then a lot of speculation about it on the part of the Japanese as they're like conferring about it. But the movie, or not the movie, the TV show was able to delve into that a lot more. And certain characters were transformed and had a much greater life than they did in the book. But the book is pretty short. I mean, most of Philip K. Dick's novels are, you
Yeah.
know, not that long, right?
It's deceptive though, because they make you
Because
think.
there's so much built into them.
Yeah, they're dense.
Yeah. So Man in the High Castle in this edition is a little over 200 pages.
This is 273, and this is the Mariner versions. They all have
Okay.
this cool, colorful color.
Yeah, those are a nice collection. Those are the ones that I was reading at the Milwaukee library because they bought like I guess they must have like bought them all at once or something,
They got a deal.
Probably, yeah. I
By that
mean,
book club deal you're talking about.
yeah, there you go. Yeah, I wonder what the book club one actually looked like. It's probably kind of crappy
It's
cover.
probably worth a lot of money now. Watch. It's
Probably, yeah, just not to the poor Philip K. Dick,
yeah. Oh,
who died, pretty poor. He lived pretty poor and died pretty poor. I mean, that's one of the things that comes out in so many of the interviews that he wrote such great stuff and just was never rewarded for it in terms of money. And he might have been if he'd lived longer, with
yeah, I
the
think if he had
Blade
lived
Runner.
longer, yeah,
Yeah.
I think he would have. But it's like Biggie said, no one pays attention to you till you're dead. And once
Yeah.
you're dead, you kind of get immortalized in some ways. And I would like to think that if he had stayed around or been able to stick around, that he would have been paid his due while he was alive. But a big part of this has to do with the attitude of science fiction literature in America. And he talked about
Right. Right.
in those interviews, he said, Man in the High Castle and his other books did very well in Europe. And he said Europe just did not have the same kind of nose up attitude to science fiction that America did. America was very much not a fan
Yeah.
of it. And he also said it had to do with the political nature of science fiction at the time. But he said multiple political groups in Europe actually had science fiction committees because they thought it was that important.
Yeah.
And whereas the United States, it was considered drivel because it was not literary fiction to them. And I think that had a big part to do with it. And I think the attitude has changed over time, especially in the 2000s. We've seen almost an elevation of science fiction where, like, for instance, President Barack Obama mentions the three body problem as one of his
Right.
favorite
Right.
books.
Yeah.
That was a big deal. and I just don't think he was around to see that.
I think he got to see some of it happening because there was this what they called the new wave of science fiction that was happening in the 60s and 70s. So like Zelazny, who he collaborated with on Dies Irae,
Mm-hmm.
was part of that. This sort of incorporating not just the human sciences or whatever you want to call them, the soft sciences, but also literary techniques
Mm-hmm.
being folded into it. Michael Moorcock and Ursula K. Le Guin, they're all part of that. Dick just didn't benefit in the way that they seem to. And it's interesting too, because somebody else who points this out about the attitude about science fiction is Stanislaw Lem, who's writing from behind the Iron Curtain, for a long time, but observing things. Polish, great science fiction writer, and so it's he's seeing this, especially in America, this separation, and it's not a popular separation, right? It's the elites who are like, this is real literature, and then that crap that you have down there,
Mm-hmm.
science fiction, romance novels, fantasy, mercenary stuff, detective stuff, that's all just that's for dummies. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly some people probably still carry that opinion, but I do think it's gotten better here in America, over the last 20 years. And that's probably, and also his works being republished and pushed
Oh
out
yeah.
and definitely given its due. And let's be honest, the adaptations don't hurt. Even if they are not faithful, adaptations almost always result in more book sales, especially when they're good. Like Blade Runner is, it is massive. I mean, it's
And Blade Runner ended up spinning off its own sequel. I mean, we'll see
Mhm.
if we get any more. So there's the potential of having a lore, right, about it.
Mhm. Oh,
Um,
definitely.
if somebody else wants to take it up. I mean, I don't think is it Blade Runner 2045? Am I getting the number wrong? I don't think it
2049, I think.
okay. I don't think it did that well. Like
It
it
didn't do
wasn't.
well, but people think it's a fantastic film.
It was, and it was one of those films that seeing it in the theater really rewarded that experience, because there's a lot of things. I think our TVs are so big now that we don't have to go in the theater, and they have the surround sound and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But that one was one where you really did want the big screen, and because the soundtrack has all of this bass stuff, especially deep horns in it, that are supposed to produce a sense of dread in you. You can do that with your TV at home, but holy crap, being in the theater and feeling
Mm.
like your seat vibrating because of the soundtrack, it made a difference, I think.
Yeah, and those theater exclusive experiences are fewer and far between anymore.
Yeah.
Obviously, Oppenheimer is probably the most recent one, but I do remember
Did you
Blade
did you go
Runner.
and see it in the theater? Or?
Oppenheimer?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. It was awesome. I loved it.
That's cool. I haven't been to a movie theater since before COVID, and I think it had been a couple of years when COVID hit. We just don't do it that often, because we're kind of layabouts here. So
Well, the next one for me will be Dune 2, which the person who did 2049 was Zimmer, who also did uh, Dune and 2049. So uh,
okay.
his scores are always absolutely ridiculous. Like he's just a madman, and I love it. I cannot wait to see Dune 2. I cannot wait. It's gonna be great. Um,
Did you see the Dune 1 in the theater then, or?
yeah, my first
Okay.
ever IMAX experience was Dune,
Oh,
and
okay.
bro, it peeled my cat back. Like I was like, I could not believe what I was seeing and hearing. I was like, this is incredible, man. And I'm a big Dune fan. So I was I mean, I haven't been by the way,
Yeah.
I've been a big Dune fan for a super long time, not like an OG, but like I read the book and loved it. And then getting to see it in theaters, it was just like
Yeah, I think people asked me about that when the Dune 1 came out, and I watched it here on our TV at home with my wife. And I mean, it's not perfect, but I think it's a pretty good adaptation. I don't think there was a lot of screwing around with stuff like David Lynch's Dune was. I mean, I saw that and I was like, holy crap, what the hell's going on here?
yeah, the thing's like a cult classic now.
Yeah. I mean, that's another good example of a very loose adaptation, I would say, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, when I read A Scanner Darkly, maybe we'll have to do another discussion and we can kind of break that one down,
That would be
especially
fun.
because
Yeah.
you like it so much. And I would like to try to get to it by the end of the year, but we'll see. We'll
Okay.
see. We'll see what I can do. Um, I also have to find it in this edition. That's a problem with getting these pretty editions. I have to find every one of them in that edition now because the bookshelves, they got to
They
look
they
good for
they
the
need
camera.
they need to match, right?
That's right. It's a very important to me. But I want to thank you so much for coming
Oh,
on here.
thanks for
And
having me on. Yeah.
yeah, I was super glad that you wanted to chat about this. And I didn't get to put out a book review for this because I feel like what hasn't already been said about this. But I think we found something to talk about that was pretty interesting. I think the Book of Changes uh, obviously affected Philip K. Dick and his book very much. And I think it's one of the more unique backstories to any story that I've ever heard.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, how many books were created using any sort of combinatoric,
And
divinatory
sticking to
thing?
the
Probably not
decisions
many.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, like really sticking to it, being like, "I trust this thing." It's wild.
Yeah. That's quite true. Yeah.
It's a lot of faith. Uh, so tell people where they can find you. I do have your, stuff linked in the description below, but,
Well, I think I may have mentioned this last time. It's super easy to find me just by typing Gregory B. Sadler into Google because all of this stuff comes up like on the front page. And it sucks for all the other Gregory or Greg Sadlers out there because they're all, way down below the fold. But it's, people can find my YouTube channel or my business site or all the other things pretty easily that way. And if people want to learn more about Man in the High Castle, I've got a whole Philip K. Dick playlist that they can check out. And right now, all I've done is a few Worlds of Speculative Fiction sessions, I think 3, and then I've done Man in the High Castle and The Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, and I also did a address that Dick gave, The Android and the Human, which is he actually thought was one of his best nonfiction works.
hmm.
It was a address that he gave, and it's really quite interesting. So people can find those and see what they think.
Yeah, and I would highly suggest everyone check out Greg's speculative fiction series. He has covered so many amazing series over there, and I think that for my dollar, that's all. I'm always excited whenever you read something I like because I'm like, oh, he's gonna break it all down. It's gonna be great. Like Prince of Nothing would be a great example of that. So people, make sure you go check those out. They're fantastic.
I had somebody just in my last AMA ask if I was going to do the remaining 4 books, and I was like, "Yeah, maybe someday." But I mean, it's a lot,
It's a lot, and
backers. You know, I don't think I can do one on each single book like I did for the Prince of Nothing. I was like, I'd bundle 2 together and then another 2 together. But they're also they're wonderful books, but depressing. You know, in a
they
way
take a
that's even more so than like Stephen Donaldson. Um,
yeah, far
so
past it. Yeah,
yeah.
it is a what's the word? Burden to put on yourself.
Oh, that's
It
a good way to put it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, it really does feel like you're carrying the weight of that narrative because it is bleak. But if you ever do that, I
Yeah.
would be super excited because I think that the sequels have some of the best stuff that he's ever written. So
Yeah, I think you're right. I just wish he'd like come out of his seclusion and start bringing out the promised, final books of the series.
we can
But
hope.
I don't know if we're going to see that. He might be done, you know.
I will. I'll ask the Oracle tonight. That's the perfect way to tie it all together there,
There
isn't
you go. Yeah, yeah.
it? Folks, if you enjoyed this discussion, it would mean a lot to me if you would hit like and subscribe if you're not already, and then go check out Greg's channel. It's linked in the description below. We want to thank you for checking out the stream, or if you're watching after fact, thank you so much. I appreciate you giving us your time. And until we see you next time, be good, be safe. Remember to always keep turning the page.